You're listening to Flipping the Channel, conversations with experts and executives from the electronics industry. In each episode, we attempt to understand and unravel some of the business and technical challenges brought on by component obsolescence. Here's your host, Bill Bradford, President of Flip Electronics.
Welcome to this episode of Flipping the Channel. I'm very pleased to have as our guest in this episode, Greg Wood, Director of Product Management with IHS Markit. IHS Markit is a research firm that, among other things, tracks trends of end-of-life and process change notifications of electronic components. So we're very pleased to welcome you, Greg. Thanks for being on our show today.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's nice to be here. And I thought I'd start just to give you a little bit of information on my background.
Great.
I'm a degreed engineer, graduated in 1986 with a mechanical engineering degree. And I spent early on in my career, I spent some time doing some job shop temp jobs, and I gained a lot of experience. One of the companies I worked for was a power supply manufacturer. So I got some experience in being able to deal with electronic components and understand the manufacturing at the time. After that, I did some software work and got into the component information business, of which I've been involved for the past over 20 years with 4 different companies. And so that's given me some real insight into new developments and new trends in the industry that I hope to go over on this podcast. Great.
So how long have you been with IHS Markit then?
I have been with IHS Markit in 2 different segments for about 20 years. Was IHS at one point, and I worked for them in the 90s. And then we merged with a company called Markit. And so I've been with IHS Markit now for 13, 14 years.
Great. Well, tell us a little more about IHS Markit before we get into what you're seeing out there. What kind of firm is it? What do you guys do at IHS Markit?
IHS Markit is a global information and insight company. And at a high level, what we do is we provide executives with key information and insight that allows them to make competitive decisions and stay ahead of their competition. They're involved in a number of different industries, including financial markets, automotive industry, energy, and the group I work for is under what's called Consolidated Markets, which also has a standards reselling business.
Okay. Well, so let's dive into the electronics supply chain a little bit. Tell me what you've observed this past year in 2020. It was certainly an interesting year for the world. What have you observed in the supply chain?
Yeah, it certainly was a lot of uncertainty in 2020. And I think we saw some of that in the supply chain as companies were really trying to reestablish their manufacturing locations and their manufacturing lines. And we saw that to a certain extent in the supply chain with lead times getting extended toward the end of 2020. And we also saw some reasons for that included changes in buying behaviors for people that were under lockdown. They wanted to be able to have their new TVs and new game consoles and new phones. And so that created sort of a shift in the supply coming into 2021.
Okay. Besides the consumers, obviously we've been seeing a lot in the news around the automotive sector as well. Have you guys, I guess, been paying attention to that part as well?
Absolutely. There's been some very significant impacts to the automotive industry in 2020. And it has to do with the shortage of semiconductor devices. A lot of microcontrollers, microprocessors are in short supply. And it's caused major automakers to either shut down plants or scale back production significantly.
Okay.
So that's expected to have a $61 billion impact to 2021 sales in the automotive world.
Wow. Let's translate to some of the trends you're seeing specifically around the end of life area.
Yeah, so 2020 saw a significant increase in end of life communications that we received from manufacturers. So we saw about 25% more in 2020 than we had seen in 2019, rising to an all-time high since we've been recording this information over the past 20 years. Likewise, we've also seen increases in product change notices, probably about a 20% increase there as well. So some significant additional communication that manufacturers are getting out about their components.
Look, if we could dive into that a little bit more, particularly around semiconductors, what are some of the specific trends in end of life you're seeing on the semiconductor side by product families, et cetera?
We see a number of very interesting things. Generally, there is a move to design products with lower power consumption, which creates less heat dissipation, more miniaturized circuit boards. So really, what we've seen for semiconductors is a move to end of life some of the older outdated components. So things like heat dissipation, heat sinks, and higher power devices. Certainly some of the larger, certainly through-hole components are end of life much more regularly. And so we've seen also in terms of the product families, we've seen a lot of oscillators and crystals almost doubling their EOLs this year when compared to the average of the previous 3 years. And we've seen a lot of EOL activity in optoelectronics, and then also in some traditional integrated circuit areas with programmable logic, seeing an increase of about 60%. Also microprocessors, microcontrollers, peripherals, sensors. So some significant uptick in EOLs for particular part types that we've been seeing.
Interesting. If we go beyond semiconductors, what other components are you seeing the same kind of thing in electromechanical and passives, interconnects, and that type of product?
We are. We're seeing some additional, it's not quite as much as semiconductors, but we are seeing some of the older devices getting end of life, sockets, for example, or circuit protection devices. So we see a lot of transformers and getting end of life, and about 50% more capacitors by affected parts, and about 30% more resistors are getting EOL at the part level.
So do you think this accelerating trend of end of life and process change notifications is going to continue into 2021? What's your outlook for this current year now?
I think it's going to continue. I don't expect to see quite the volume level increase. I don't expect to see 25% more EOLs in 2021, but I do expect to see more EOLs than we had in 2020 going forward. So it's going to be something that companies really need to pay attention to, and to be able to plan very carefully around their part buys and last time buys specifically.
So what do you think the real root reasons are for seeing such a big increase in end of life notifications?
Well, I think there's a number of different reasons. Certainly discontinuing some of the older technology devices, but also companies are preparing for removal really of the substances of very high concern from all their product line. and that's to support some of the new regulations that we're seeing in the European Union with the skip regulations, with the eco designs, the conflict minerals. So certainly there's some EOL activity as a result of some of the new legislation. But I think mainly it's to restructure their product offerings for manufacturers to support their most profitable lines, get some of their older parts converted to new part numbers for customers, and really rationalize a go-forward approach that's going to be the most profitable for the manufacturers.
Okay. You mentioned the trend as well around the process change notifications. Is that driven by the same reasons? Tell us more about what's going on. Why also the increase in PCNs?
Yeah, so there has been a significant increase in PCNs, and a lot of that we're seeing assembly process and assembly site changes. So I think some of that is to give some options to avoid tariffs. So we see some added assembly sites in Malaysia, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. And really to meet global demand continues to increase. And so they want to reduce lead times, get the products out to customers as soon as possible, and really ensure they've got good supply chain continuity.
So what's your advice to customers in this environment? If there's no end in sight for this trend, particularly customers that have to support products for longer than your typical 2-year consumer life cycle, how should customers deal with this situation?
Well, that's a very good question. I think one of the main things that customers can do is they can get a good, reliable component information source to be able to track and monitor their parts on a daily basis and provide end-of-life and last-time buy opportunities. So that'll at least give companies an opportunity to be able to plan a last-time buy, or to be able to, excuse me, or to be able to identify an alternate part that they could utilize in their existing designs.
So certainly a great lead into IHS Markit, coming full circle here. To tell us a little bit more about what those offerings and information sources are from IHS Markit.
Well, at IHS Markit, we have a great product offering that revolves around our parts component database. And we've been collecting components on information on components for many years now. And we're able to supply customers with end-of-life notifications. We're able to monitor their bill of materials on a daily basis and provide part status updates. And we have this information available through a variety of products that allow companies to do individual part lookups, monitor their bill of materials, and really be able to integrate the content directly into their internal systems. So there's some great options available to help companies really manage a very difficult and growing problem from an information perspective.
Oh, very good. Any other products or services that our listeners should be aware of from IHS?
Well, certainly IHS has many different product offerings. There are some good overlaps in the parts business with our standards business. So, for example, if companies are concerned about counterfeit components getting into their products, there's a number of standards available through SAE, IEC, and other standards organizations that help them put in place counterfeit mitigation strategies and keep their brand clean and make sure that they don't see any counterfeit components getting into their products.
Oh, very good. So how can our listeners learn more about IHS? What's the best way to get information to better understand these resources?
I think one of the best ways to do that is just to go to ihsmarkit.com and market with an I, and search on electronic parts management solutions. And you'll be able to see the portfolio of all the products and also get some good information on how to engage with IHS to help solve problems that we're seeing in the component industry.
Very good. Now, this has been very helpful. I think as we see this accelerating trend, as mentioned earlier, more and more industries are really getting caught kind of flat-footed on being able to support their products. And so having this kind of insight and data available to better plan is certainly a great solution. So really appreciate you sharing this with us today, Greg. I think as dynamic as this situation is, we'd love to have you back on a future podcast, to kind of look at the trends, maybe second half of the year to see what's changing or how these are accelerating. And any final thoughts or comments from you?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be available for this podcast, and certainly have enjoyed it, and hope that provide your audience with some ideas on what we're seeing ahead, but also some potential solutions or some support through some of these very challenging times.
Very good. All right. Well, thanks again for joining and being a part of this podcast, and we'll talk to you again in a future episode.
Thank you. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Flipping the Channel. Please remember to join us in our next episode, where our special guest will be retired Rear Admiral Tom Tron. Tom, at one point in his career, oversaw the Defense Logistics Agency and has some real insight into how the Department of Defense is dealing with obsolescence and obsolete and end-of-life components. This will shed some real light and insight, particularly to our defense-related customers. Until next time.
You've been listening to Flipping the Channel. This podcast is brought to you by Flip Electronics, where we're making obsolescence obsolete. Visit www.flipelectronics.com for your authorized, hard-to-find, end-of-life electronic component requirements.